Afternoon and welcome to Cosmic Shambles Sunday Science Q&A. And today we're doing, as we've been doing over the last year, normally about kind of 3 months, a little update on our kind of understanding of COVID. And you've sent in a lot of fantastic questions about that. And we have a brilliant panel, all of whom have been on before. Obviously, you will see Helen Czerski shortly, and we're also joined by Dan Davis and Sheena Cruickshank. Mention a few things before we get started, one of which is if you can support us via Patreon, that is fantastic. But thanks to Patreon supporters, we are able to make at least 2 shows a week that are free to everyone. And then also, if you do support us via Patreon, there's a load of other stuff as well, like the Uncanny Hour documentary series that I do about kind of horror movies and weird fiction and stuff. And the most recent episode of that is about John Carpenter movies, and that's got Stuart Lee and Alan Moore and Reece Shearsmith and Clara Nellist and Priya Natarajan. We've got proper physicists talking about the nature of good and evil from the perspective of John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness. Samira Ahmed's on it as well, and so those come out every couple of weeks. And every week as well, we have a new series called Tips for Existence, where I talk to scientists and artists about kind of understanding the best ways of trying to get through life and the methods they've found if this universe is unfortunately without any grand meaning or purpose. And the first 2 of those, Brian Greene and Nicole Stott, the astronaut, earthling and artist, and the next one that's coming up on Wednesday is Tim Minchin. I had a long chat with Tim Minchin, so all of those become available to you if you support us via Patreon. But that's, if you're able to. We haven't hit our target yet, but we're making about 4 or 5 things a week anyway, and we're trying to make them better and better. So I hope you're enjoying what you're seeing. And then tonight, the Young Ones quiz. It's Rick Mail's birthday today. He would have been 63. And last night I was on Mastermind. My specialist subject was the Young Ones. And just to make it quite clear, yes, I did forget the answers bacon sandwich. And I do know that chalk is predominantly made out of calcium. And I do know that it was General Franco. But you don't know what it's like when you're in that chair. It is very, very nerve-wracking. And also, John Humphreys asked such long questions that I forgot what they were by the end of it. So you can stop putting the questions about chalk in the live chat. Well, we've got about 5 of them. We'll deal with those. But after that, we don't need any more questions about chalk. Well, we might need some, actually. There's a lot of issues with chalk, so I'll leave that up to you. And that's it. That's it, really. That's all I need to tell you about the beginning. And let's start with meeting Helen. And Helen, you have I presume you have this week in science history for us.
I do. But before we get that, now I have to confess I haven't caught up with your Mastermind appearance last night. But if there's a question about calcium and chalk, so quite a lot of the chalk you actually use to write on blackboards now isn't chalk from cliffs, and it is made of magnesium. So I don't know what the question was. However, you might well have been justified in saying magnesium if it wasn't natural chalk, because lots of chalks, there are chalks that are based on magnesium instead of calcium. You're on the right bit of the periodic table. Anyway.
Can I just say, when you work out why you've had a long working relationship with someone, that was exactly one of those reasons there.
They won't have me in the back of Mastermind. Can you imagine the little sideshow at the end? Little scientist going, "Oh, I think you'll find." Anyway,
you and the Doctor Who fan who goes, "I'm afraid, John, that is not the correct answer about the Sidemen. We must do a retake."
Yeah, it'd be great. Anyway, so yes, in science this week, we are going back to 1791. And what happened in March of 1791 is that Luigi Galvani published his book on animal electricity. Well, he thought it was animal electricity, and it was the culmination of 11 years' work of doing things that sounded quite unpleasant, to be honest. Some of them in collaboration, these experiments, scientific experiments, in collaboration with his wife, and they were applying electrical potentials. They didn't know what they were, but applying electricity of some sort, as far as they were concerned, to bits of dead animals one way or another, and finding that muscles twitch. And at the time, so he was convinced, it's a really kind of interesting history here, because Galvani sort of got there first. It was known that if you applied some electricity to a dead bit of animal, the muscles twitched. And he thought that was animal electricity, the spark of life. And then Volta came along at the same sort of slightly afterwards and said, well, actually, this is just a chemical reaction. There is a chemical reaction that can generate an electric potential. And so Volta was nice enough to call it galvanism, named it after Galvani. And then it carried on as a physical thing, this understanding that you could generate an electric potential by having a chemical reaction. But actually later on, Luigi Galvani became known as the father of, I'm going to check the phrase here, electrophysiology, because, of course, our bodies are full of electricity. There is a potential difference of voltage between the inside and the outside of a cell, for example, membrane potential. Our nerves operate entirely on, electric signals being sent to and fro. And so in a way, I think, and of course, everyone at the time was fascinated by this. And there was a public demonstration after Galvani had died where they did this to a human corpse. They got some prisoner that had just been executed and made his face contort and horrible things. But in principle, I mean, and this sparked, so Mary Shelley, so this was in 1791, that demonstration with a human was 1803. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1818. And so this was a huge topic of public interest. And then it led through to our understanding of cell biology and certainly our nervous system today. And so animal electricity, it's sort of in there. It does do things. I once saw IVF being done on a cat. Long story. Anyway, the point where they actually join the other, they took out all the DNA from one type of egg and put in different DNA. It was a bit more complicated than a normal procedure, but anyway, there was a spark of electricity. They genuinely put a spark across it to fuse the two together. And so I think, this idea of the spark of life and Frankenstein, it wasn't that far off. But yes, so all of that got started 230 years ago this month.
To the graveyards, my friend. We have work to do. Thank you very much, Helen. And Sheena Cruickshank is with us again, immunologist, based as both of our guests are at the University of Manchester, Professor of Biomedical Sciences there. Sheena, hello.
Hello.
Do you have a show and tell for us today?
I do. And it's this. Can you see that?
Yeah.
It's actually a desert rose, but I picked it because it reminds me of an immune cell, which I'll probably have to show you a picture of, which I'm just bringing up now. Cancer. Does that work?
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. So how big is that? The thing in the picture?
It's probably about 3 to 5 microns big, which is 10 to the 6 smaller than a meter. Meter? Is that
it's
right?
It's a thousandth of a millimeter, a few thousandths of a meter. Is that right?
On. Didn't sleep last night. Anyway, that was coined a veiled cell. So if you go back to the turn, so I'm going to do a bit of history now as well. If you go back to the turn of the sort of 20th century, there were kind of two camps in immunology. So there was this idea of innate immunology, which was Metchnikoff, which was this idea that we've got inbuilt ways to kind of recognize and deal with infection. And then you had kind of Ehrlich and people like that who were coming up with this idea that you had specific immunity and specific responses, clonal responses that were very fine-tuned to the immune response, which ultimately became what we know as adaptive immunity. And of course, we know that that's things like your B lymphocytes, your T lymphocytes, and people have actually heard of T cells now because of all the things around COVID. But what they didn't know is how these two systems related and how particularly the T cells were getting the information that was going to tell them how to be clonal, how to recognize those specific parts. They knew it was really tiny, tiny, tiny little bits. It was like amino acids. They were able to work that out, but they just didn't know what was happening. So there was this sort of quest to kind of join the two parts of immunology together. And so there were the research groups. There was 2 research groups, and there's a big research group in the States, which is really kind of given all the sort of credit for discovering it. But there was somebody working on it in the UK, and that's why I referred to the veiled cell. And that was Bridget Balfour, and she was working in the UK, and she was very interested in a special type of innate cell that she'd seen called a macrophage, which is what Metchnikoff actually discovered. And macrophages can kind of gobble things up. But she'd noticed that there were some cells that seemed to kind of leave the skin site, and they traveled through kind of channels in the body we call the lymphatics. And if she tapped those, drained them, she found cells that looked like this. So she called them veiled cells. And she started to wonder if they were a little bit different. And meanwhile, Steinman was looking at the same problem, and he was looking at some cells that I think I've got the first image he took of them here. So they're not veiled anymore. They are, in fact, dendrite-y. And he called them dendritic cells. And it turns out they actually are the same cell, but they have this ruffled appearance when they're traveling through the lymph to get to the sites where they're going to give the information to the T cells. And it was these cells that were the vital piece that were able to take information from pathogens or cells. They could take it from kind of look at cancerous cells or virally infected cells and take information from that, process it into the right kind of way and with the right type of signals, give the information to the T cells. So the T cells then knew what to do, and the T cells could then clonally proliferate and go off and deal with the infection. And of course, Steinman ultimately got the Nobel Prize for that. But there you go. That's my show and tell. The desert rose or the veiled cell.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. And we're also joined by Dan Davis, Professor of Immunology at the University of Manchester. And you have a new book that's out. It's not out yet, is it, Dan? I don't think.
Yeah, it's not out yet. No, it's not out yet. No, 1st of July.
1st July. Right. So the Secret Body. What have you got for your show and tell, Dan?
Well, I didn't go with immunology. I went with this book here. Brian Greene's The Elegant Universe. Many of you people watching this will know this book. But this is a particularly special copy of this book for me. When I did physics for my PhD, and then I went to the US and worked in immunology. And when after your PhD, you're called a postdoc. And when you're a postdoc, often you also help other students do their research. So I had an undergraduate student doing a project with me. His name was Isaac Chu. He is now a professor at Harvard who studies how the immune system interacts with the nervous system and how pain works, for example. So, but at that time, he was an undergraduate. He didn't actually seem like the kind of guy that was become a professor at Harvard. I remember him once at the microscope in a darkened room, falling asleep onto a mushy banana. But he was the project student I had, and his father was Xingtung Yao. Is Xingtung Yao? Xingtung Yao is a very, very famous mathematician. He won the Fields Medal for maths, which is kind of like the Nobel Prize of maths. When I was leaving the US to come back to the UK, Xingtung Yao was very grateful that I'd helped his son do some immunology in the lab. So he gave me a present, and this was the present. At the time, Brian Greene wasn't as famous as he was now. This book had just come out. It's kind of a classic now. But what he had done, because Xingtung Yao was well known, is he had sent this book all around different places in the US to get it signed by all the different people that are in the book. So you'll see that my copy is signed by lots and lots of, well, maybe you can't see that. I'm going to drop it. But it's signed by lots and lots of different people. So it went all around the US, signed by all the different people in the book. And so it's a special copy of that book. And the book itself is absolutely brilliant. Many of you already know that. You spoke to Brian Greene very recently in book Shambles. And so it's also, for me, a couple of other things. Firstly, it's also about the idea that all of science is really important to me. So it's, I might be able to talk a lot about immunology, but I also deeply enjoy reading about hidden dimensions, time travel, as both Robin and Helen and you do in these programs. All of science is profoundly, deeply important to me. In lockdown, reading, thinking about different kinds of science has been some solace, I think. And I remember Robin did the show once, Happiness Through Science. Maybe that was years and years ago. But I like that title. I don't know if happiness can come through science. Obviously, happiness also comes from connections to people. But that also happens in science. So it's all entwined. That's the thing I have to show and tell.
See, I think that's the thing because happiness, that was because there's so many people who presumed that everything every time you face up to some evidence-based reality, it lessens you as a human being. And it was kind of a rebuttal to that. And in fact, that's the book that I've just written now, which I'm still editing. But I think that's one of the things, isn't it, which is about connection, as you mentioned, which I think that is when you start. I just pulled out this is on my desk at the moment, which is Until the End of Time, which is Brian Greene's most recent one, which is probably the one which has the most about the importance of looking at the human reaction to the understanding of the universe. And I think that's the thing, is that the more you read, the more you go, whether you're looking at a picture of the cosmic microwave background radiation, whether you're looking at, when the understanding of genomes, etc., all of those things just keep adding connection and adding stories, and I think that's beautiful. So yeah, I would highly recommend his work. And the first question I'm going to throw out to you is actually a question from me, because it's something I don't understand. Don't worry, I'm not going to cover everything I don't understand. We don't have that kind of time. But
is it chalk?
Yeah, no, chalk is, well, a lot of people seem to be under the false idea that chalk is predominantly chalk. I've heard actually it's mainly magnesium nowadays. It's barely calcium at all. Anyway, but the is about the fact that if you're vaccinated, the difference between being vaccinated and not therefore getting ill with COVID, but the ability to still transmit COVID is something that I don't understand. So Sheena, can you, what does that, what is the, because I've read various things. My wife was just telling me about this, the fact that you can be vaccinated and you can be basically immune, but you can still transmit. So how does that work?
Yeah, there's different aims sometimes with vaccination. Sometimes you're trying to get what we call a sterilizing vaccine. And a sterilizing vaccine means, for example, you've got really high levels of neutralizing antibodies. As soon as the pathogen gets inside you, it's destroyed. Or you can have what we're really getting with the current COVID vaccines, is vaccines that will give you immunity, but not sterilizing immunity. So they're reducing the kind of severity of the infection. But what that means is there's a chance for the virus to get in, and particularly they think it can sort of start proliferating, start sort of dividing in I'm pointing at my nose, our upper kind of airways. And while that's happening, until our immune system kicks in to flush it out, that means that you've got a chance for being able to spread it. It won't necessarily make you sick, and it will never go to the extent that it would go if you had no protection, but you do have a little potential for reservoir. But it does actually look like the spreading is massively reduced. I think they've done some studies now of that, and they have shown that there's quite a reduction in transmission as well from the vaccine. So it's really, really encouraging.
Brilliant, thank you. That answered that question. That's great. This is Angela's the first question from someone outside of this world, and she has. There's been a lot of talk that the current vaccines can be easily modified to combat new variants in the future. Will this mean another round of fun testing, or can these be rolled out quite quickly? So, Dan, do you want to answer that one?
So it is that they probably can be rolled out pretty quickly, actually. So. At the moment, the vaccines seem to work well against the different versions of the virus that are most prevalent at least in the UK. But there is some evidence that some of the strains may not be picked up as easily by people that, may not be dealt with as easily with people who've been vaccinated. But it's actually very easy to create new versions of these vaccines. So, for example, the Pfizer vaccine that is essentially a sort of a genetic message that encodes one of the protein molecules made in coronavirus. You could easily just change that to be the genetic sequence correlating with a different version of this type of this virus. So it would be very, very easy for companies to do that. The making the new vaccine, I think, is actually very straightforward, but then it has to go through the testing process, which takes some time, and then it has to be rolled out. So all of that would be, those would be the key determinants of how long it takes to get the vaccine to all the people in a safe way, rather than just literally making the new vaccine is actually very easy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. If you have got a question, just pop it in the live chat or tweet at Cosmic Shambles, and Trent will send them to me. JLK 100. First part of JLK 100's question is, I'd really like to know about the difference between vaccinating adults and children. Do children tend to react differently to vaccines used in adults? Sheena, would you like to start on that one?
Well, I think, again, that's a good question, and it depends on the vaccine. There's lots of different kinds of vaccine. So for COVID, I think the reason that they're not vaccinating children at the moment is because children weren't really thought to be as at risk from the infection. They weren't really thought to be transmitting the infection as much, although kind of reports that are coming in are sort of varying about that. And of course, it wasn't then tested in children. That's not to say that it won't be safe in children or be effective in children. But I think it's what we're seeing is vaccination in a kind of pandemic kind of, you're prioritizing the people who need it most. But of course, many vaccines are given to children. And we know that we've got a whole schedule of childhood vaccines that are absolutely critical to protect them. Things like the measles vaccine, the flu vaccines. But here the children tend to get a slightly different version of the vaccine. I'm not sure whether that's because they have a different reaction or whether it's because it's a more palatable version, because they tend to get the nasal vaccine, which is actually also an attenuated live vaccine. But yeah, no, I think it's really down to that. And there's some evidence as well that the type of immune response children have when they get COVID tends to be of a more protective immune response. There have been some initial studies trying to unpick how different people are reacting. So I think that answers the question.
And just there's a follow-up question that occurs to me, Sheena, which is, how do clinical trials work for children? Because obviously consent is a difficult thing. So just in terms of the clinical trial process, is it the same? Are there any differences?
I think it's the same, but you'd have to get the parents consenting it. So the ones that I always think of where children are often vaccinated, or some that have been happening recently, are some of the malaria vaccination trials, where it's very much children that you want to target because children seem to be particularly vulnerable to the very, very worst effects of malaria. So often they are the ones that are mostly targeted in vaccination trials. But you go through all the same stages. There's a very regimented series of steps and series of safety tests that you're doing, from does it invoke a bit of an immune response? Is it well tolerated? If you take it to people who aren't exposed to the infection, is it well tolerated before you actually take it out into the field? All these steps are still happening with COVID, but they're all happening in a very, very truncated kind of period. We're able to do them much more quickly than waiting to get funded or waiting to get volunteers, which is the usual scenario.
Something I was. Oh, sorry, Dan.
I think the Pfizer vaccine was in the clinical trial they did go down to people aged 12, I think, in the initial trial that they did, and so I think Sheena's right in the sense that it's really at the moment targeting the people who are most vulnerable from suffering with the worst end of the type of symptoms you might get. But I think there is some evidence, it's not that it hasn't been tested in children at all. And different countries are taking a different approach to what to do with that. There's even other, so for example, this comes up, there's a similar question relates to all kinds of different groups of people. For example, pregnant women is another category where you can't easily, but that there are also some data on that. So out of one of the trials, for example, I think there were 23 women who were on the trial and didn't know they were pregnant and then took the vaccine. And then they're following those women and there's been no problem so far. So I think that, for all, there are lots of different categories of people that in time will know exactly what the outcome is, and that is going to lead us. What's really important about that is that there's never been such a enormous global experiment in vaccinating so many people before. So we're going to get loads of information about human diversity, about our own individual responses to vaccines across all different groups of people, by age, obviously, also by all other categories of person you might want to suggest. And I think we're going to emerge from this with a really deep new understanding of what each of us, how each of us responds to something like a very specific vaccine, which is going to create, categories of people, and then in time that should lead to a more personalized view of how treatments will progress. It would be entirely plausible that one version of the vaccine works a bit better in elderly people than younger people. But that's just the beginning. That would be just the tip of the iceberg. My feeling is that it's very likely that we will see an enormous level of diversity in our immune responses to this vaccination program, and then we'll be able to use that in.
Something I was happy. I was talking to Rupert Beale, who has been on this before, who's based at the Crick Institute, and talking to him last week, he was saying that there's been actually, when you look at the anti-vaccination movement, sometimes on social media you can imagine there are huge ramifications. He said actually there's been the uptake has been about 95%, and it's like he said in terms, and 5% is roughly what they would normally imagine in terms of the time you get to conspiracy theorists, etc., who are quite dogmatic about it, and he's seen some vaccine hesitancy, but more often than not, people have then been persuaded. And of course, the more that people see, the more they go, oh, this is fine. So I think that's one of those things, because sometimes with conspiracy theories, you can think, oh man, how is this really going? And from his outlook, I think it's really positive. And he's very positive, I think, for vaccines as a whole, because the anti-vax movement, as we know, via the things of the MMR, etc.
What I find really interesting about that, Robin, is that varies hugely from country to country. So apparently, I mean, I was reading today, I think it might have been in the Observer, I can't remember. One of the newspapers was it had a very different picture in France. And actually, a little while ago, I was happened to be talking to Anthony Lloyd, who's the war correspondent for the Times, and he was in Afghanistan, and he was saying that people there were like, COVID, we don't need to worry about that. There's a war going on, right? We don't need to worry about things to do. So I think So although we worry about the sort of anti-vaxxer movement, that is perhaps just a small aspect of what it is that stops people taking the vaccine. And there's a lot of culture in different, a lot of things play into whether people take up the vaccine or not. So yeah. I think we still got quite a long way to go in our country, as you say, right now. It's true that it's going very, very well, but globally, there's still quite a lot to be done, I think.
Though it's not universally going globally well. So I do a lot of work in communities, and there's definitely much different feelings in a lot of communities that I work with, and we've got a fantastic patient advisory group that feeds into the COVID Immunology Consortium. And so they're based in all sorts of communities across the UK. And again, there's a real difference. So we know, for example, Black, Asian, minority ethnic people are less likely to feel trusting of the vaccines. And there's probably a difference with different age groups as well. So the older generation that we're seeing, perhaps, yes, they are more trusting. But again, if they're white, that seems to be the predominant area. I mean, I remember Tony in our advisory group said that he knew of some of his friends who were secretly getting vaccinated because their children didn't want them to have it. So they weren't telling their community members that they were being vaccinated. They were doing that on the fly, which is really, really interesting, but a little bit worrying. So I think we have work to do. We've got to keep working and reaching out to these diverse communities.
There's a good, actually, Radio 4 had a documentary on about a young man based in Bradford who's been, I think it's called My Name is Jordan, but have a look. It's one of the My Name is series, and about the work that he's been doing to go around the community and to give people some kind of assurance, really, of the truth about vaccines. This is not someone who's vaccine hesitant. It is from Brian, who is a needle phobe, and Brian says it's probably likely, he's in his 40s, that in the spring he'll get the COVID jab. And what worries him is, because he's a needle phobe, he's worried about the fact, he said, can he use numbing gel? If he went to a pharmacy and put numbing gel on his arm before receiving the vaccine, would that be in any way damaging towards the vaccine? Sheena?
It's an interesting thought. I'm not aware of any research that suggests it would be damaging. One of my friends actually is involved with delivering vaccines, and she does say that they are used to dealing with people who are phobic of needles, and they have got procedures to help support people like that. So he is absolutely not alone. Lots and lots of people are nervous of the needle. It's very, very quick, and you really don't notice it. So I think if you're not looking, it'll happen before you're even aware of it. But I don't think the numbing gel will have an effect. Do you, Dan?
I can't see why it would have any effect, no.
Brilliant, thank you. This is now, you were mentioning malaria earlier. This is from May. May would like to know, says, will the advancements we've made with RNA vaccine, thanks to COVID being translatable to other diseases, to RNA vaccines, will that be translatable in terms of our understanding of other diseases? I've read it may be useful in combating malaria. Dan?
It's definitely going to be, it is true that this is definitely a revolutionary moment for making these kinds of vaccines, and they will be used in other situations, but it doesn't mean that it's the answer to everything. So I'm hugely confident that RNA vaccines will become a feature of, the medical landscape, but there are still issues. We still don't have an HIV vaccine, right? And it's not for want of trying. So there will still be diseases for which we still can't vaccinate against. And so, it is a good moment, but there's a lot to be done. I mean, it's not, this isn't going to be the answer to everything. Vaccines tend to work quite well, actually, for infections that come in through the respiratory system or through the gut. But vaccines don't work well for other ways in which the infectious agent gets into the body, which is one of the reasons why it doesn't work. One of the reasons why HIV vaccines haven't worked so well. And so there are lots of issues around getting a vaccine to work well. But certainly this is a good moment for a new way of making a vaccine.
Malaria is really hard. I mean, malaria, it's got a complex life cycle. It's got a life cycle in the mosquito. It's got very different stages of life cycle and immune response that you need to deal with it in humans. You've got a blood stage, a liver stage, and then another blood stage again. And it also changes its features for immune recognition as well. So it's got these what they call variable genes, so it can kind of switch the way it looks. So all of those things make it really, really complex to try and design a vaccine for. And when you're trying to look at things, for example, in different animals where it's, things have got a life cycle in more than one species, it can be quite difficult to actually have effective lab models. But malaria is one of the best invested, ironically, kind of infections ever. In malaria and HIV, I think there's a great deal of money on them, but we still haven't got vaccines that are 100% effective because they're difficult. They're really difficult.
It's something that I've heard say, a question that I've had and friends have asked me, and I don't know the answer, but it's something that certainly a year ago and more, people would look at the latest rover landing on Mars or, amazing widget that went into space, and they'd have a cold and they'd be sitting there with their snotty nose and headache, and they'd be going, how is it that we can put a rover on Mars and we can't sort out the common cold? Does this put us any closer to maybe vaccinating against the common cold in all its many wonderful variants? Or are we still just have to look at and go, get cross?
The common cold's lots of viruses. It's not one virus, so that's tricky. There's several families of viruses that cause the common cold, and again, that you've got other issues with them. Some of them they change a lot, so they switch up and change around, which is difficult for the immune response. But also our immune response for some of the viruses, like some of the coronaviruses that we're experiencing now with COVID-19, do cause the common cold. We've got about 3, I think, that are common in the country, and we don't seem to mount a long-term immune response to them. So we are immune for a little while, and then the immune system seems to forget. And there are definitely some infections we are aware of now that the immune system kind of forgets over time. And malaria is also an example. You don't ever get a complete sterilizing immunity to malaria if you live in the country where malaria is common, and we don't know why that's happening. So that's an interesting thing. So yeah, there's lots to learn still about immune recognition, but mRNA vaccines, great.
I think what's interesting about that, Helen, is that it sort of has this idea that getting something onto Mars to take pictures would be harder than dealing with the common cold. But actually, I think that it's kind of easier, right? So getting something onto Mars is sort of right. What do I need? I need to escape the gravity of our planet. I need to make sure it's pointing in the right direction. I need to get it to sleep. I don't want to belittle the effort it takes to do that, but I can kind of see, even from the little bit of basic physics I know, I could see how that could happen. Whereas trying to interfere with this sort of minuscule bit of genetic information packaged in some kind of little thing I can't see that's entering into the body's cells. I mean, that to me, it should be seen as actually the harder problem that it really is. I think understanding life, the human body, the world of germs, the viruses, the things we can't see, I think that is harder than just getting a chunk of metal to take a picture from Mars. So I think it depends on your viewpoint, right? But we shouldn't, I think it's a really hard problem to tackle things like disease and how, even just how the body works. So many unknowns, there's so many questions that we could ask about the human body or life in general that seem very basic.
Well, isn't that the thing, that biology is basically more complex than physics? Because biology, you go physics, chemistry, and then you get biology. So all of those wonderful things that, trying to understand a virus and trying to understand, mercury, there's a very different kind of complexity there, which is one of the reasons that it is such a fascinating area. Virginia would like to know, we're a year into this now, so what do we now know in terms of long-term effects, long COVID, etc.? Can I start with you, Sheena?
Long COVID, I assume that's what the question is about?
Yeah, basically, what do we know about the long-term effects of COVID generally, including long COVID? Obviously, sorry.
Well, it's something we're still learning about. Some studies have suggested that one of the things that might be happening is that you have autoreactive antibodies. So, you're making all these antibodies against the virus, but you seem to have made them perhaps to your own cells. So it's a bit of like an autoimmune disease condition. They've definitely described higher levels of these sort of persistent autoantibodies in at least some of the cases of long COVID, which perhaps gives some hope that there might be some ways that we can look at manipulating it. I guess one of the other things that's almost certainly happening is you sometimes you're having a really systemic immune response to this virus, particularly if it's gone a bit kind of wrong. You've had a cytokine storm. This will cause an enormous amount of damage to the tissue. And that's probably one of the reasons why you then get the autoantibodies, because you're releasing all these damaged cells. But if you've had a huge assault to the body like that, it takes a very, very long time for the body to repair. So I think for some people, they may not have the autoantibodies, but it might be symptomatic of the fact that their body's got to repair over a long period of time. But it's something that's being actively researched right now in the COVID Immunology Consortium. It's some of the questions that they're looking at right now. And they've got a year of funding to look at that. But I really hope all the research councils actually look to extend that, because I think the questions about COVID and the immune system are only growing all the time. But obviously the importance of the discoveries we're realizing is also growing equally. But I don't know if Dan wants to add to the answer.
I can't easily add to that other than to say, it is a really important topic. I think just anecdotally, our understanding of the long-term effects of all kinds of what we once thought of as an acute infection, when you've eradicated the presence of that virus or germ from the body, there are long-term effects that we very, very very, very poorly understand. So, and my guess as well would be that long COVID itself is very complicated, involves very different kinds of things happening in different people. So it's a hugely important area where I can't add anything to what, it's a lot of
now I'm going to see how many we can get through, because we've got so many questions. This is from Lee, who would like to know the panel's opinion on mask wearing post-pandemic. How do you feel about the continuation of just wearing masks and how helpful that has proved to be? I know that's probably picked up on people talking about the flu season, etc. Sorry, Sheena, do you want to start? I should have told someone, yeah.
I think we're both being really polite there. I think mask wearing is going to be around for a bit. I don't think COVID's going away. I don't think we're going to eradicate COVID. I just don't think, unfortunately, that's likely. I think we're going to move to hopefully a place maybe akin to flu, where it's a condition that we're managing each year. We have an expectation. We're looking at annual COVID vaccines if the virus keeps changing. So I think there is a possibility that mask wearing will be something that may be more long term. I certainly think it can't go away in the near future. Really, really can't go away in the near future. We haven't, until we've got everybody vaccinated and we're more confident that the levels are right down. I think the mask wearing is going to be the thing. And I'm lucky enough to do some work with Kath Noakes, who's on Sage, and she's a big advocate, of course, around mask wearing and how things distribute within rooms. And I think she would probably say the same, but I will ask her when I next see her on Tuesday.
But is it just about COVID? You know, there's a cultural thing in the Asian countries, particularly, that if they have a cold, they wear a mask and they take that responsibility themselves. And it feels like that might stay. I mean, once people are aware, once you've spent, a year or more thinking about little droplets getting everywhere, do you think that will? Because in this country, everyone's always been sort of dismissive of that. But might this tip the balance to people being a bit less selfish, I guess, in that regard?
I kind of hope. I think people are also a lot more aware of how infections transmit. Because we know about droplets, we know about the importance of not using your hand when you cough, because that's what people used to do, or they used to. I remember seeing somebody coughing all over the place when I was on the train, and then they just went and put their hand up to hold the bar, and I was just like, just completely grossed out. It was a really packed train. Now that would never happen. People would cough like that, wouldn't they? And yeah, I think so. And the flu season was so much better because people were wearing masks. I mean, I don't know if I hope you're right. There is a greater awareness and the importance of hand washing now. Hopefully that means our children will bring home less disgusting things from school and college than they currently did. Although I'm not confident. 3 days after being at school at the start of September, my youngest brought a cold home that he gave us all. So I'm not confident.
Dan, did you want to add something? Well,
I remember in the beginning of this thing, actually, I think we did one of these Shambles discussions about it, where it was a debate about masks, and it does seem that masks then, initially it was, do masks help? Do they not help? There was a lot of confusion. Then it became clear from sort of analysis of who's wearing masks, who's not wearing masks, and how many people were infected. It turned out that masks help, but. And so, it's true that wearing masks might become part of the fabric of our society, but I am a bit upset about that, because it is true that they will help us deal with infections, and that's true. But it's also true that we lose something by wearing masks. So I'm obviously, an advocate that we need to wear masks. I'm obviously wearing masks everywhere, but I do feel sad about it. I do think it's one of the things. It's a big issue for us. If I'm smiling at someone I recognize in the street and they don't know I'm smiling, I'm not sure they could tell it in my eyes, because my eyes are just always looking like they're tired. So I don't know. We do lose something by wearing masks, I think it's a bit sad that we're going to be wearing masks for some time. There was a survey in New Scientist this week I read that said that, they interviewed a whole bunch of experts. I don't know who the experts were, to be honest, but some experts, and 200 of them were asked about a survey. So whoever responded, that people did say that we're going to be wearing masks for a long time, till at least 2022. So it looks like it's here to stay. But I am a bit sad about that, because we lose something.
I'm happy about that, because I'm really bad on facial recognition. So that takes a lot of pressure off me. This is from Joanne, who would like to know. She says, genuinely confused as to how asthmatics are considered at risk from flu and get a jab, but not considered at risk from COVID and excluded from level 6. So, Dan, that's what's the explanation for that?
Yeah, so it's true that at the start of the pandemic, we did think that people with asthma who were entitled to get the flu jab would be particularly clinically vulnerable. But as the data emerged, it did seem it is clear now that people who have their asthma well controlled and it's not particularly severe were not at higher risk of dying from COVID-19. So it's really that fact just comes from the empirical data of what's happened, to people with asthma. And I think that's true of a huge amount of what we know and what we decide from this illness. So our answer to that question doesn't really come from a sort of deep understanding of the virus, the cells, what happens with asthma, what happens in this or that situation. It really just comes from looking at what's happened to people and then saying, oh, right, so people who have their asthma under control and don't have a particularly severe case of asthma, they are not at any higher risk of dying from COVID, because that's what the data tells us. So essentially, that's the answer to the question just comes from what has happened to people. So we do have obviously a sense of what the risk factors are, being older, being obese, your ethnic background, all these things that you all know about. But if your asthma is well controlled, it doesn't seem to be a crucial risk factor in
Brilliant
COVID.
Thank you, Dan. Pam would like to know, what is a protein spike and why does it make the virus more contagious? Sheena, do you want to start on that one?
So the virus, I don't know if I've got one of them kicking around. They look a bit like my dog's toy. they're like a little spiky ball. And what the virus needs to do is, the virus can't replicate on its own. It's just basically a sort of a little kind of bag of fat that's on the outside, and in the inside there's some genetic code. But it can't replicate on its own. It needs to nick the replication machinery of a host cell, which of course is our cells, particularly our lung kind of lining cells. And so it needs to have a way to get into the cell. And the way it uses these little kind of spikes on the outside of it. These are the spike proteins. And we know that they specifically latch on and recognize to something called a sort of acetyl. What is the receptor called again?
ACE2.
It is ACE2. I was going to call it acetylcholine. It's not. ACE2, which is on the cells, and then it uses that to get into the cells. And so modifications in that spike protein can affect how efficient it can get into the cells. For example, there can be the use of like enzymes that kind of help it get inside the cells. That's been one of the things that's been described. So we know that if we block the way it gets into the cells, that's a really good strategy for vaccination, because we're blocking how much can get in. And that's also a really good strategy for our immune system. So a lot of the antibodies that target it are actually trying to stop it getting into the cells in the first place. So that's one of the mutations that we're seeing, are changes to the structure of the way it gets into cells. That was a very long-winded answer. Sorry.
No, that's great. I'm going to get on to the next one, which is from Joanne. She'd like to know, hear the panel's opinion on the 12-week gap between jabs that the UK and nowhere else seems to be doing. Is this a risk worth taking? Dan?
Yeah, so again, these kinds of things, they don't come as much from a super deep understanding of what happens in 9 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 weeks. They just come from the data, like how much of a positive outcome is there with these. And it seems like at the moment it does seem like it's good. When the doses were spaced apart by 12 weeks, people were better protected. It just comes from sort of in the actual data of what happens to people. So I think it turns out that was the right decision. But of course, it just comes from sort of empirical. We haven't tested every single dose. We haven't tested every single possible variation in length of time between doses. We haven't compared different groups of people. But from what we have done, that plan has worked really well.
So just to be clear, are you saying that actually it might be better with a 12-week gap than it would have been with a 3-week gap? Because I think that's quite an important point in this. Yeah, it's not just it's the same; it might actually be better.
Yeah. So at the moment, it looked like it was more protective to wait longer between the two doses, but there's a sort of lot of nuances and complications in that, which is that if people are somewhat protected but not fully protected, does that create a sort of bigger reservoir of virus that may by chance acquire mutations that then spread more effectively? So but in terms of dealing with a strain of virus that exists right now, you are better protected with that longer gap between the two doses. But in terms of protecting society in the long term, there's still sort of more understanding needs to be done about what conditions create opportunities for the virus evolution to happen. Because we're fighting against that essentially at the moment.
Right, the next it's got one of the words that I always mispronounce, so get ready for this. This is Avel was reading on Reddit this morning about vaccine efficacy. I can't really say efficacy, right? Just so you know, and about the 2 standard doses versus a low dose plus a standard dose. That it actually seems that the efficacy of the low dose plus the standard dose has been better than having 2 standard doses. Can I ask you, what do we know about this?
Yeah, so this was the AstraZeneca trial. So they did 2 standard doses in the phase 3 trial, but they also did an arm of the trial. Arm's an unfortunate choice of words. It is a subset of the trial that got this lower dose followed by the higher dose, and overall they seem to have higher level of protection. So they wondered if this was going to be a way to go. But I think when they've been looking at the real world data following all the vaccines that have gone in, they have concluded now, or maybe it says more of the people who had that lower higher dose thing have gone on, that actually it's better to have the 2 higher doses. It's not better to have the lower higher dose. But what we are seeing is evidence that it's working really well to have the bigger gap between the doses, because I think if I remember rightly, that was the other thing that happened in that lower higher dose scenario, is there was a bit of a bigger gap, if I remember rightly. Is that right, Dan? I'm trying to remember the paper as well since I've read it.
Yeah, I think that is right. Yeah, that is what happened. But they were also given in different in different environments.
It's different countries, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it was hard to interpret at that time. But yeah. Okay, carry on.
I was going to throw VWR2211, possibly not birth name. What is a rapid antigen test? Why can some tests get results back in 15 minutes and others require lab work? Dan?
Yeah, so it depends how the test is done and what it's looking for. The test where you send it off to a lab, they're doing a particular reaction called a polymerase chain reaction to look for the genes that are the virus itself, and other tests can just look for example, whether you have antibodies that could stick to a protein that the virus has. So there are different kind of tests looking for whether in your blood you have signatures of an immune response to the virus, or looking for whether you have the genes of the virus that then requires a more complicated test to do.
Brilliant. This is a general one which I can throw out to all of you, really, from TJ, who would like to know, how worried are you about schools reopening? So what's your general attitude in terms of schools? Sheena, can I start with you?
I mean, the evidence is mixed about whether or not children are a major reservoir for the virus, and I think I've got mixed views. In some ways, it would be great if we could be super, super, super safe and we'd not have anybody back until we saw the levels drop right down. But then it is so bad for kids' well-being to be at home. It's also quite bad for some parents' well-being to have the kids at home. I'm really feeling for colleagues who've got very young children at home at the moment and they're trying to do the job. They have this just look of utter exhaustion, trying to homeschool and do the job and look after the kids. So I think from the well-being point of view, I think it is actually quite good for the kids to get back to school. I'm encouraged that they are going to be tested and monitored. That is a really positive step. It would be good to look and the teachers, it would have been, I don't know, maybe they should have put them in a higher priority group for vaccination, but hopefully most of us are going to have received our vaccines anyway if they keep rolling out at this rate. So a lot of them will be getting their vaccines, so we'll have that concern sort of gone. But yeah, I think it's balancing, trying to make sure that the cases are really low with well-being from my perspective. But Dan may have a different take on it.
Dan?
No, I mean it's really hard. I have 2 teenage kids, and I can see the effect on their sort of well-being in general. It's really important that schools reopen. The question of whether teachers should be vaccinated, I think, is really difficult. I would honestly love teachers to be vaccinated, but I do also understand that the argument is. I understand the argument that if you vaccinate teachers, then what about police? What about supermarket workers? What about all these other groups of people that are in direct contact with people? And I do understand that it is simpler to just go by age group and keep it going and keep the momentum for vaccinating larger numbers of people. So I do understand that, and it is really, really hard. I wish the teachers were vaccinated, but I understand it's really difficult.
Helen?
Yeah, so I think one of the things the schools going back, I think you just have to try it. The benefit seems to be it's before the Easter vacation, right? So it's a couple of weeks, and then we can sort of pause and see what's happened. The one thing I do think in the prioritization of the vaccines to teachers thing is that it's a sort of extension of what Dan said, is that every time someone goes up the priority list, someone else comes down the priority list. And it really bugs me that people don't talk about that. And it's not a bad thing. It's just that you have to be, like, by definition, everyone can't be a priority. And there have to be priorities because you can't physically press a button and vaccinate everyone this second now. And I just wish that this was one of those discussions where it's not this group. It's like, okay, where are our priorities? Is it, if these go up, then these go down? Is that what we want? And I wish that debate was more honest in a way, because I think it's too easy for people who are worried and frightened and all these other things for very good reason to kind of go, oh, but what about me? And what about this? And what about this? And there is a place, I think, for sort of taking a step back and going, okay, we hear you. So let's run some scenarios. And if we push this up there and that goes down, is that okay? Is that what we want? And I think there needs to be more of that kind of discussion, but really open. Like, transparency is absolutely key to the trust on this.
Well, my career is still over to at least in this attic, so I can probably put very, very low priority. The good thing, though, is
that if it stays sunny, your hair and the sunshine is giving you a halo.
Well, do you know what? That's actually not my hair and the sunshine. That is my natural halo. Thank you.
Robin, let me just come in 1 second. I think it's really important what Helen said. It's really important what Helen said there. That we can actually, like, I think that all of us as the public, as just citizens, could take a bit more data than often the media give us credit for. So that, that exact debate, if we vaccinate teachers, what exactly would it mean? And, like you just say, what are the priorities? And literally, how does it affect the overall? We could take that data, and that could be infinitely more transparent. That is where I think the government messaging could get a lot.
And remember, there are huge parts of the world that haven't had access to vaccines yet. And until the whole world can be vaccinated, none of us are really safe. And I think that's the other thing that gets forgotten is, the countries that can afford it have gobbled up as many vaccines as we can, which is great for the people who live there. But there's all these countries that are really, really vulnerable at the moment. So.
Thank you, Sheena. We're out of time, but I'm going to keep going anyway, and then anyone can leave at any point because we are at 4 o'clock. But I want to try and cover everything. If you are disappearing now, just to remind you, 6:30, Josie Long, Lise Mayer, and special guests will be doing a Young Ones quiz. And also, if you can support us via Patreon, this is the way that we keep making all these kind of shows as a small public service broadcaster out of the attics of the world. This is from Jivon and also from Emma as well. We've had pretty much the same question. And this is not really a science question, but I'm interested in hearing the thoughts on what old normal things you think will be victims of the pandemic, or at least be hugely overhauled in terms of things like offices, business trips, and the use of remote learning. So what do you think might be the biggest changes that we'll see kind of remaining, some of the things that will stay in place? Helen?
So a shift to local living it's one of the biggest things, both for the climate and for people's mental health, is appreciating their local environment, having friends in their local environment, maybe moving to somewhere where they like their local environment, and then just living more locally. That shift in the importance of the high street actually being a place for people to go to. Not like, I understand there are retail jobs that have been very, very hard hit by all of this, but in the long term, wouldn't it be nicer if the high street was a place you went to spend time with people rather than just to buy stuff that you and the planet doesn't need? So, and also active transport, people getting out on bikes and walking, all that kind of thing. So I hope that those are two long-term shifts that we'll see. And then the other one is just a bit more empathy, like, other people are not idiots. I don't know if maybe I'm a bit too optimistic here, but this idea of key workers, suddenly everyone works out, it's not just teachers and nurses, but how about the people like this year, they have literally been tens of thousands of seafarers on cargo ships who cannot leave the ship and cannot go home. And they are working to bring our freight here, and they are legally not allowed to leave their ships. They're basically in a kind of indentured slavery now. And no one's, there's all these people who were invisible until something like this makes them visible. And I think remembering that there is a system that we rely on and just lifting the lid on how it works, I think that would be a good thing. I mean, I've got a whole list of other things, but I should probably let Sheena and Dan take it.
Well, we'll do those next Sunday, okay? Sheena.
I agree with Helen, actually, about this idea of appreciating where you are and making the most of outside. I mean, I'm lucky enough to be a bit more countrified where I live, and I've seen a lot more people going out and enjoying the kind of fresh air. And I would like to think that would stick. And this idea of just appreciating some of the little things in life a little bit more. I don't think as many people are going to go back in 5 days a week. We're not going to be flying around all over the place. We're going to really I'm so excited about seeing my friends in real life. That to me, people saying you want to go abroad. I don't care about going abroad. I want to see my friends and have a cup of tea with them. It's my horizons have come down, but that to me would be one of the most exciting things. And just cherishing those moments, I think is probably what I would say.
Dan?
Well, I agree with everything you guys have said. And I mean, I honestly didn't really know the people that live on my street before, which is just sad, right? But now I kind of do know about them, and so I think that hopefully we'll keep that. It's also true, actually, I mean, I've always enjoyed live art and culture, but it's phenomenal how much of an impact not having that is on my life. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, what I wouldn't have thought, going to see Robin Ince in some pub with 50 people is so important, but it does seem really important. But going to big music festivals, right? I mean, it's amazing how not being able to do that has had such a huge impact. So I think although science is going to get us out of this, art and culture has got to be, seen as this massive thing that we've lost. I'm no fan of James Bond, but I will definitely be keen to go and see that James Bond movie that's been held on someone's DVD player for the last year.
Yeah, some of the cinema owners, not only. It's a very interesting thing. We'll have this debate at some point, because I think one thing we found out is that though people have realised the importance of the arts, what we've realised is that an enormous number of people, and I know it's not the only area, but it is one of the areas that has really suffered in terms of people who've not had any form of bailout whatsoever, who've not, who've really. And also, I'll just quickly mention the fact that if you actually see the amount that the arts brings into the UK, and you see the fact that what's happened via Brexit as well, is going to destroy a huge chunk of it. And I will go on a soapbox later on. I'm going to open my window and you'll be able to hear it at least as far as Aberdeen, and I'll try and project it a little bit further than that. I'm just going to throw some questions at you, and if possible, if you could just tell people where they can go to find out more about this, just so we can try. Helen wanted to know, talking before about Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, about the fact that what knowledge have we now got in terms of the fact that certain groups, it does appear, have been more adversely affected, and it's not merely been down to socio-economic factors. Where are good places for people like Helen to go to find out more about that?
The UK Kick website is very good, which is looking at all the immunology of COVID. Also looking, it's got stuff about kind of how the virus is changing. So I think that's generally quite a good source of information. I know research is now being funded into those questions particularly. Conversation's always a good place as well. You see a lot of helpful little resources there. Have you got any to add on that one, Dan?
There was a documentary on TV really recently about it, and I can't remember what it's called. But the bottom line is that we don't know the answer. But it is a really important issue. We don't know the answer as to why the BAME group has been so severely affected. It's crucial that we work this out, but we don't know as far.
Quick one from Donna. Is it a good idea to get a COVID test before getting the vaccine? Does it matter if you're asymptomatic, for instance?
I think so. They have done a bit of research trying to ask if people have different immune responses if they've had COVID, and some people are having a kind of bigger response, I think, to the vaccine. So it's certainly not going to protect you against your asymptomatic infection if you've got it when you get the vaccine, because vaccines don't work that quickly. They're not a treatment; they are preventative. If you've only just got, I don't know, if you've only just got the infection, I'm guessing, because it takes a while for the immune system to get going with the vaccine. It'll take a while for your immune system to get going with the COVID. So I'm not sure it'll make much difference. But certainly if you've already had COVID, it can make a bit of a difference to how you react to the vaccine. I don't know if you want to add anything there, Dan.
I can't see why it would be of any particular issue. So I think get the vaccine.
Brilliant.
Whatever.
Thank you all very much. I think we got through nearly. I'm sorry the questions we didn't get to. Hopefully, Penny, Mark, and others. I think we kind of answered your questions earlier on. I'm sorry we weren't perhaps as specific, but run out of time. Next week, I can't remember what we're doing next week, but we'll be doing another subject. Helen will be back. Sorry, Helen, there wasn't as ploughed the COVID stuff today. I hope these things have been useful to you. We'll do another COVID show probably in 2 or 3 months' time as well. And the main thing is I was talking to Emma Hodcroft, who was on one of the first ones we do, which is just keeping up to date, because we were talking about the fact that the first one of these we did, as we were saying about masks, there was a great deal of uncertainty, and also Emma talking to her was saying also the worry about the shortage of PPE when you were uncertain means that sometimes there was perhaps holding back on when we didn't have a full understanding mask, and that kind of stuff is still getting spewed out by people when it's no longer in any way relevant. So that's one of the things. Keep up to date as much as you can, because this is an ongoing situation, and as we found out today from Sheena and Dania, there's still a lot of things that aren't understood, and there's still a lot of work being done. Thanks very much for watching. As I said, back at 6:30 with a very different thing. I hope a supremely childish take on the young ones. Next week, Tim Minchin is on Tips for Existence. Also, Book Shambles this week is Mark Steele and Natalie Haynes, and we're talking about Jeremy Hardy. Thanks very much for watching. Support us via Patreon. Thanks to our producer, Trent. Bye-bye.